Peace be with you. Friends, our first reading for this weekend is taken from that wonderful middle section of the prophet Isaiah. I think I told you before, Isaiah is divided by the scholars into three sections, 1 through 39, they call it Proto or First Isaiah, and then 40 through 55, this middle section, sometimes called Deutero or Second Isaiah. Then some even say from 55 to 66, Trito or Third Isaiah. I'll leave that to the Bible scholars, but the point is that central section is full of some of the richest theology in the whole Old Testament. And the passage for today that the church gives us conveys an extremely important spiritual point, and one that I think we rarely avert to, but I think it's, especially today, I'm going to suggest, of tremendous importance. So, everyone knows that in the Bible, Israel is the specially chosen people of God. Of all the nations of the world, God chose Israel to be his special priestly and prophetic people, right? But do we attend sufficiently to the fact that biblical revelation does not begin with the formation of the people Israel? You could say that begins in Genesis chapter 12 with the call of Abram, right? The call of Abraham. And from the family of Abraham comes eventually the people Israel. Now, to be sure, most of the Old Testament is then focused upon the formation of and adventures of this people Israel. However, the Bible does not begin with Genesis 12. Go back now to Genesis 1. What do you find? But God's creation of the whole universe. Salvation has to do not just with Israel, not just with humanity. It has to do with the whole of creation. That's part of God's salvific plan. Now keep pressing it. We don't get to Israel till Genesis 12. When we're talking about Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah and his family, all that period, we're not talking about Israel yet, are we? We're talking about humanity. So Adam is the father of the whole human race, and then after the flood, Noah is a kind of new Adam, a new father of the entire human race. Not Israel specifically, but all of humanity is God's focus, God's interest. And I love this. Some people suggest a covenant with Adam. There is a kind of covenant, but I think the most, the first really explicit covenant is the one with Noah. So before any covenant with Israel, there's a covenant with all of humanity. Listen, this is from the book of Genesis. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, "As for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, as many as have come out of the ark." Again, notice please, the covenant with all of humanity, and indeed with all of creation. That's the great setting for God's salvific work. Now, he does indeed choose the people Israel, beginning with Abraham. How come? So that they might be set apart from everybody else as God's unique focus of attention, so that they might be singled out of everyone to be saved? Well, no. As I explained a couple of weeks ago, he chooses Israel indeed. He singles them out indeed, not for themselves, but for everybody else. He chooses Israel for the rest of humanity. And may I press it, he chooses Israel for the whole world. On the great temple in Jerusalem, both outside and inside, were decorations that evoked the planets and the stars and the animals and the plants and all of creation, because somehow in the praise of Israel, all of creation was giving right praise to God. In other words, everybody, there's always a universal background to everything that God does with and for his people Israel. The creator of the universe loves and cherishes all people and all things. Therefore, you do not have in the Bible the fussy religious provincialism that you often find in other religions of the ancient world. What I mean here is, well, yeah, we have our God, or gods, the gods of our country. And I know you've got your gods over there to take care of you. Read the Iliad and the Odyssey if you want to see this on display in the ancient world. The gods of various peoples and nations battling each other. You see overtones of that sometimes as background in the Bible, but what's interesting is the God who reveals himself is not a God uniquely of this place or this time or this people, but rather the creator God of the whole universe. Israel's chosen, yes, but not in a fussy provincial way. The God of Israel is the God of all people and of all things. That relationship, that dynamic, it's most important not to forget as we move through the Bible. Now, why am I talking about this principle? Well, because of this extraordinary passage we have today. It's from chapter 45 of the prophet Isaiah. Get your Bibles at some point today and look up Isaiah chapter 45, and you'll find this passage dealing with a man named Cyrus. Now, who was Cyrus? Cyrus was the king of Persia. Now, let me just give you a little background. We all know that in the year 587 BC, the great Babylonian exile commences. So the Babylonians came, they conquered Judea, that's the country around Jerusalem. They lay siege to the capital of Jerusalem. Eventually they destroy the city, they burn down the temple, they take the best and brightest of Judea and they carry them off now into exile. It was probably the most traumatic event in the history of Israel. Then, some decades later, the Babylonian Empire weakens, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquers Babylon and becomes, in fact, one of the greatest imperial figures in the ancient world, commanding a huge territory. But then Cyrus of Persia does something fascinating. He notices the Jews, the Israelites who've been carried away into exile. And instead of further exploiting them, he decides that he will liberate them. He will allow them to return to their home country. In fact, he will provide funds for the rebuilding of their temple. This foreign potentate, this king, who knows not the God of Israel, and yet he proves to be one of the greatest benefactors in the history of Israel. And something it's unique in the Bible. This foreigner, this non-Israelite, is called by Isaiah Messiah. Extraordinary, isn't it? Mashiach, the anointed one. That's a title given to David, the greatest king of Israel. The Mashiach, the new David, is the one that Israel is hoping for, who would definitively restore their glory, who would be the bearer of God's presence to them. The title, yes, eventually given to Jesus himself, Yeshua Mashiach, Paul calls him. Well, Mashiach, Messiah, is now being used of Cyrus of Persia? Yes, indeed. Listen, in our passage for today, God says to Cyrus, "For the sake of Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen one, I've called you by name, giving you a title." Boy, I tell you, not just a title, like the title. "Though you knew me not." One of the greatest benefactors of Israel is not an Israelite. One of the greatest benefactors of a nation is not someone who knows the God of Israel. But listen, someone whom the God of Israel, who always has a universal purpose in mind, uses for his own purposes. Now, that's the story. From it, I derive this principle. There is a happy medium the Bible wants us to find between what I would call a bland religious relativism and a dangerous religious tribalism. Let me just say that again. There's a middle ground. The Bible wants us to find it, I think, between a bland religious relativism and a dangerous religious tribalism. What do I mean? Well, go back to the years I was coming of age in the church, let's say the 1970s, 1980s. There was, I would say, on vivid display, a bland religious relativism. There was a tendency to say, well, you know, all religions, they're basically the same. We're all climbing the one holy mountain by different paths. You know, you got your religion, I got my religion, and who am I to be imposing my views on you? And, you know, tolerance and open-mindedness, and that was all the rage when I was coming of age. Well, it should be clear, I hope, that the Bible has no truck with this kind of bland indifferentism or relativism. No. The true God is being described in the Bible. Israel, in fact, is chosen, and the new Israel, the church, is in fact chosen as God's privileged vehicle for the communication of the fullness of his truth to the world. The Bible wouldn't hold by any means that all religions are the same, or it doesn't matter what you believe. No, from the beginning, Christians have been a creedal religion. We clearly articulate our beliefs. We don't have truck with a bland relativism. On the other hand, there's a danger of falling into what I've called a religious tribalism that is so insistent upon what's unique and distinctive and my own in religion that I become antipathetic toward anyone outside that religious circle. No, we're right, you're wrong. No, God's revealed it to me, God loves me, not you. No. The Bible has no truck with that. Why? Because prior to the covenant with Israel, we have the covenant with all of humanity. Indeed, with all of creation. Whatever purpose the uniqueness of Israel serves is for the good of the whole. Whenever you're defining yourself in this kind of closed way over and against everybody else, whenever that gives rise to violent attitudes or actions, you've moved outside the biblical space. And see, go back to this passage in Isaiah 45. Who gets the title Mashiach? Well, David does, yeah, and eventually Jesus gets it, but also Cyrus of Persia got the title Mashiach, was recognized as a great benefactor of Israel. God chooses this nation, yes. Reveals his distinctive truth, yes, indeed. But for the sake of everybody else, for the sake of all the world. See, that's the subtle middle ground that the Bible is trying to draw us into. And God bless you. We have to deal with the great, abiding, central questions about God, about meaning, about where my life is going, about death, the fact of death, the fact that I'm confronted with eternity. You know, there's this life I'm leading, and then it's surrounded, as it were, by eternity. But those questions are so hard, and they're so challenging, and they're too immense. And so what I do is I distract myself endlessly from them.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. We love being distracted. Why is it so hard to sit still, quietly, and contemplate reality? And how can a 17th century philosopher help us escape this quandary? That's what we're discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us as he usually does from our studio in Rochester. Bishop, welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning. Good to see you as always.
You have had an extraordinarily busy last couple months, but probably the big event was your international travel to World Youth Day, which was in Lisbon, Portugal. Tell us how that went.
It was great. I loved it. I've been to 4 World Youth Days now. I was in Madrid, Krakow, Panama, and now Lisbon, and loved it. You know, you get 1 million or whatever kids showing up, and we wandered around the city and was able to talk to all these different groups. I gave 5 separate talks. My favorite really was the evening with the English speakers, mostly American kids, like 15,000 in this big park. And we had Blessed Sacrament adoration, great sacred silence, you know, in that moment. I gave a little 20-minute sermon. Loved it. Loved the opportunity to reach out to the kids and to evangelize.
Well, I want to talk to you about one of our mutual heroes, Blaise Pascal. He was a 17th century French mathematician, physicist, Catholic philosopher. You know, I studied engineering and physics in college, and those who have taken math or science courses will recognize that his name is what's used for the unit of pressure. You know, that there's 5 pascals of pressure, 10 pascals of pressure. But he wrote a great philosophical work called the Pensées, where he famously observed this. He said, quote, "The sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." He also says in the Pensées that, quote, "Our nature consists in movement. Absolute rest is death." What's Pascal getting at here?
Oh, he's such an important figure. You're right. A fascinating figure. Dies young. He was only in his, late 30s, I think, when he died. But made this, as you say, massive contribution to the sciences and to computer technology. Pascal was behind much of that, too. And then he makes this extraordinary contribution to philosophy and theology. The Pensées are really one of the great literary works of that time, and they come down to us as such a high literary quality, but also of tremendous spiritual power. I think he's an undervalued person. When I was coming of age, we didn't read much of Pascal. I kind of discovered him later in life, and I think maybe you have to be a bit later in life to appreciate him, because you might read him and just find him kind of mordant and pessimistic, but he's not that. He's a real mystic, and he combines his mysticism with high intelligence. There he's like John of the Cross, right? The greatest spiritual master, but has a Thomistic sort of disciplined mind. Pascal is similar, but the Pensées are such a gem set of... They were literally written on pieces of paper, and he strung them around his apartment in Paris. And they were collected after he died, and they think they were like preparatory notes for a great work of apologetics he was thinking about. But they've come down to us as little aphorisms. There he's a bit like Nietzsche. You know, Nietzsche's writing is in aphoristic form, and Pascal is like that. But they're just gems, and you can chew on each one, you know, and draw nourishment from them. Anyway, I forgot the original question you asked because I was going on about Pascal's life. It was, what's he getting at with the sitting quietly in a room, right? I think what he's getting at is we have to deal with the great, abiding, central questions about God, about meaning, about where my life is going, about death, the fact of death, the fact that I'm confronted with eternity. You know, there's this life I'm leading, and then it's surrounded, as it were, by eternity. But those questions are so hard, and they're so challenging, and they're too immense. And so what I do is I distract myself endlessly from them. And I can't sit quietly in a room. Why? Because those questions will invade me. Those questions will come at me. Think of it as, you know, that one of the more unpleasant experiences in life when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're lying in bed, and there's something about that time where your brain just starts sending anxious signals to you. And if you sit long enough, you know, questions of when am I going to die, and what happens after I die, and And where am I going? And does my life mean anything? And those will come to you too. And so we want to avoid that. Take a pill so I can get back to sleep and not think about those things. Or let me get out of bed so get to work and I don't have to think about those things. To sit quietly in a room by oneself, not distracted by a book or anything, or now, look at us. We're masters of distraction with all our machines. Without those things, you can confront those questions for the first time, maybe. That's what he's driving at there, I think.
One thing that is interesting about Pascal is almost as a master psychologist, he highlights the paradox that these diversions introduce. He says, and I'm quoting him, "The only thing that consoles us for our miseries is diversion, and yet it is the greatest of our miseries." Why did he consider diversions to be so problematic, first of all? But if they're so problematic, why do we still love to be diverted, to be distracted?
Yeah, because the questions are too much, right? The questions are too much. But that's the only way I'm really going to live, is by confronting those questions, which is why the diversions themselves become a source of misery, right? Because I'm going to live in a superficial way. If I'm diverting myself all the time, necessarily I'm living in a superficial way. So that produces its own misery, its own sense of absurdity. So that's why I'm kind of caught in a way. He was, long before the psychologists of the 20th century, he was so good at naming these kind of dilemmas we get ourselves into, these aporias, the philosophers call them, like these sort of impossible situations. And that's a good example, is that I can't distract myself. I must distract myself. And that's where I live, in that space. The saint, you might say, is someone who's able to set aside the diversions and engage those questions in a sufficiently serious and life-enhancing way, right? That's a saint. Or a real contemplative is able to do that. I think, Brad, like the times in my life when I've gone on a retreat and I go to a monastery, let's say, and I say, all right, this time I'm going to do it. This time I'm really going to, confront the great questions. And I'm not saying I do, but even in those settings, I find myself getting restless or bored or seeking some sort of distraction, whether that might even be like in a good book, but still the good book is distracting me from the question I should be dealing with. We can't sit quietly by ourselves. If we could, well, we might go crazy or we might become a saint,
I first got into Pascal through the work of Peter Kraft. I think a lot of younger Catholics first came that route. Kraft has this great book called Christianity for Modern Pagans, which is an annotated version of Pascal's Pensées. And here's Kraft's illustration of what Pascal's getting at. He says, quote, "If you are typically modern, your life is like a mansion with a terrifying hole right in the middle of the living room floor. So you paper over the hole with a very busy wallpaper pattern to distract yourself. Or, he says, you find a rhinoceros in the middle of your house. The rhinoceros is wretchedness and death. How in the world can you hide a rhinoceros? Easy. Cover it with 1,000,000 mice, multiple diversions." But I think where Kraft is most useful is he notes, affirming what Pascal says, that the distractions don't trouble us. We chase after them. We want to be busy. We want to be distracted. Because if we had true leisure, then we'd be forced to look at ourselves, to listen to our hearts, and see that great gaping hole that's right in the middle.
Yeah, and if you talk to most people, how you doing? Really busy. I'm really busy. And that's usually seen as kind of a positive thing. I think in my world of, priests, how's it going? Oh, man, I'm so busy. I am so busy. Or like my own life. Oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And all right, I'm serving the kingdom. I'll tell myself, and it's probably true to a degree, but am I also just caught in a Pascalian game here, of like, I'm just distracted by all these activities and trips and, so it's a good way to examine your conscience. How am I using all this stuff in my life? Do you remember this scene in one of Woody Allen's early movies where he's an obsessive over the Kennedy assassination? And so he's with his girlfriend and suddenly he just breaks into more obsessiveness about the grassy knoll and the gunman. And then she says, I think you're using the JFK assassination to distract yourself from the trouble in our relationship. And then Woody, turns to the camera and goes, she's right. Well, that's a very Pascalian moment, because I think a lot of us do that, whatever we're into. And then someone says, I think you're just distracting yourself from the question of life and death and meaning. I think you're right. So that's the covering the rhinoceros with the million mice, So what's the way out? I don't know, Brandon. It does take an extraordinary spiritual discipline to confront those questions honestly and with faith. That we do this, no one doubts it. That's clear. But how do we solve the problem? Pascal probably say, learn to sit quietly in a room. And, we might translate it into the language of contemplation. Set aside your obsessive activity and learn to be a contemplative more.
I think you're right. I think for Pascal, contemplation would be the antidote for distractions. I think, too, of Joseph Pieper, who wrote a lot on the theory of leisure and the need for true leisure. How do we distinguish between distractions, diversions, and true leisure, or from distractions? And can leisure ever turn into distractions? You gave the example of reading a book. A book, I think, can sometimes be leisure activity, sometimes distractions. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I suppose you have to look at the big picture, don't you? Am I, as a general rule, avoiding the great questions, life and death, and meaning and purpose in God? Am I purposely getting away from all that, or are the things I'm doing, from reading a book to watching a baseball game to having a good, conversation, are they in service of these ultimate goods, and are they in relation to what I've determined about those great questions? Because, it's not a stark either or. I mean, I think if you have come to grips with those questions, then, you can live your life in a joyful way, and you can give yourself to certain things, and they're not functioning to distract you. So I think it's not an either or. Pascal can sometimes give that impression of being a sort of an either or thinker. But, prayer for us, I think, under Fulton Sheen's influence, when I started doing a holy hour every morning, did it this morning, in season and out, no matter what. Well, okay, that's trying to overcome the Pascalian problem. I'm going to say, purposely, I never bring my phone into the chapel. It's on purpose, never bring it in. So at least for that hour, I'm in dialogue with God. The Psalms are leading me through a meditation on deep and important things. I'll set even that book of the breviary down and just spend some time, gazing at the tabernacle. So that in itself is a very Pascalian kind of discipline, isn't it? The holy hour. That at least for that hour, I'm guaranteed I'm going to be confronting the great questions.
I think up and down the centuries, one way that Christians have escaped diversions is by quite literally, physically fleeing them by going to the desert. The Bible and church history are filled with people who fleed distractions by going into these isolated places. Why is the desert in particular so central to Christianity?
No, that for just that reason. And because distractions fall away there. There's nothing to divert your attention from the great issues. And that's why so many, as you say, of the biblical authors. Now, the Bible comes out of a desert culture. If you go around the world, it might be into the forest or into the tundra or something. But the idea is the same, that you have to get away from the distractions. Something we've done, as a church in the new program of priestly formation, we have a propedeutic year, we call it, a preparatory year before a guy enters the formal seminary process. And one of the features of it that I really like is there's a detox from social media. So we require the students to surrender their phones. And so for a year, and I think they can check them for emergencies and all that, but for a year, basically, they fast from the internet and from Facebook and everything else. And almost to a person, they will say, that was the most important part of the propedeutic year, was that I detoxed from the phone. That's a way we can do it. That's a very practical thing we can do. That's like a desert for a lot of us. Heck, I'm looking at my phone right now because I've set it aside during this conversation, but the minute we end, I'll probably check it. Now, part of that is emergencies, and I'm the bishop of a diocese. I got to be attentive to that. But, even if it's the end of the day, there are no emergencies, I probably check the darn thing anyway. So that's a negative spiritually in our culture now.
I'm curious if you could maybe share personally how you escape diversions. You gave the example of your holy hour. You intentionally leave the phone behind, but
Right.
when you sense yourself becoming overly attached to diverting activities, how do you escape that in your life?
Yeah, well, that's the number one thing I'd say is prayer, is and to concretize that with the holy hour, and give oneself to the works of love or the work of service in some basic way. Return to the gospel fundamentals, I would say, prayer and service and study and so on. But I tell you, whenever I read Pascal, I feel judged in a good way. I know he's naming something that's very real in my own life. And there's a, how would I describe it? There's a texture to the feeling that comes from spending too much time with distractions. You know what I mean? For Pascal himself, by the way, it was gambling. Because he was so good a mathematician that he was good with cards and all that. And so he would fritter away enormous amounts of time gambling. And you think, here's one of the great geniuses of the Western world. And he knew, I wasted so much time. And I'll find Brandon at times during the day, and it's this symbol now we all have, the thumb, of we're going through the Facebook or scrolling through whatever. And after a while, it's like it's a sickness. You feel sticky or unwell. Why am I looking at these silly pictures and Facebook, whatever they are? Why am I looking at this? But his answer is, it's not just, because they're mildly entertaining. There's something distracting that your soul doesn't want, the deep stuff. And so it's attracted weirdly to this superficiality. But maybe let that feeling sink in and say, boy, I need the desert right now. I need some desert time.
It reminds me of something we've discussed before when we've talked about social media. In that famous Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, they point to the invention of the infinite scroll as one of the worst features of social media, because there's no end to the distraction. It just keeps going and going and going.
It's that, right, it's that weird thing in our psychology that you're looking at this silly, set of whatever they are, but another one's coming. This could be something really interesting. And to be fair, sometimes, sure, I do come across interesting articles or, oh yeah, I want to see what's going on there. So as you're going through, that's stupid, I don't want to waste the time, that's ridiculous. But there's one more coming, and that could be the one that's going to get my attention. And you just have to, I don't know, those things are very, they're dangerous spiritually. And I don't just mean pornography and these really explicit things, but I mean, just that dynamic is dangerous spiritually. And Pascal should be the patron saint, maybe, of our time for that reason. The very fact that he's behind computers, in a way, his theorizing was behind computer technology, and he's the great prophet of distraction, So that's interesting.
I think Crave said he's the first great post-medieval apologist, and he was born 300 years before his time. That, as you say, he could be the patron saint of our digital age.
He's buried in the Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in Paris. I used to go by it all the time. And in those days when I lived in Paris, I knew the name Pascal, but I had not really read him at all. But I used to walk by his tomb all the time when I was in Paris.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have one for Bishop Barron, you can send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we have one from Jack in Louisville, Kentucky. He's asking about the laity in the church. Here's Jack's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Jack from Louisville, Kentucky. What are some things we as lay people can do to build unity in the church?
Yeah, good. Stop being cruel to each other. We're talking about the internet a lot today. I mean, the amount of cruelty that's expressed on the internet, and, I suppose there are some clerics on the internet, but it's 99% lay people. Stop being cruel to each other. Stop using people as a means to an end. When you're dealing with someone, let's say on the internet, can you really say, when I send this response or this comment, I'm doing it out of love. I'm willing the good of the other. If you can say that, hit the button, off you go. Can't? Don't do it. Stop being cruel. On the positive side, I would say do the works of faith, hope, and love. That's what you're called to do. The laity are meant to go into the world, into the secular space, and bring grace there. You bring faith, hope, and love. And that will by its very nature bring about unity, because those are the theological virtues. So stop being cruel. Start spreading faith, hope, and love.
Well, as we wrap up here today, I'd like to share with you the first book by Word on Fire's new Spark imprint for young kids, Spark being a little flame. So this is our imprint of books for children and other young readers. The first book we're releasing is called Saintly Creatures and Their Holy Companions, just debuted. Inside this book, you will discover exciting tales of God's creatures and the holy men and women they encountered. You'll read about an enormous dog who protected a French priest from an ambush, a tiger who shared his cave with persecuted Korean Christians, a dangerous wolf who was tamed by an Italian friar, and a boar who was rescued from hunters by a wise Irish abbess. Each of these 14 stories shows the heroic virtue of the saints and inspires young readers to faithfully follow Jesus. If you're a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, sponsor, this is a great book to get for your kids and introduce them to the saints. Again, it's called Saintly Creatures and Their Holy Companions, first book from Word on Fire Spark, and I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.